learners, welcome to week 4, lesson 20. We were talking about various books that are there about learning how to live a sustainable life and how to avoid the disaster of climate change. There are numerous books that give us ideas and solutions to climate change. So, there's a book by Bill Gates also. It is titled How to Avoid a Climate Disaster. It offers a pragmatic, solution oriented discussion on the technological and policy innovations needed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Gates' book in particular suggests both market based solutions and policy recommendations for transitioning to a zero carbon economy, illustrating how non fiction writing can serve as a guide for decision makers. So, we have heard these ideas in the earlier lessons of this week also, that there are several books that talk about solutions. So, this book by Bill Gates is also an important book because it talks about market based solutions and policy recommendations for transitioning to a zero carbon economy. So, there are many more books. Let's look at another one. This is a very comprehensive book which is uh, very detailed and very thorough about solutions for climate change. Draw down the most comprehensive plan ever proposed to reverse global planning. It's a New York Times bestseller edited by Paul Hawken. So, it's a very important book, and it has been suggested that everyone who is interested in working towards climate change resolutions should have a copy of this book. This is a book that offers resolutions for reducing climate impacts. It was compiled by a collaboration of scientists, researchers, and policymakers. For example, it mentions about the installation of the microgrid, which connects various utilities, and that can replace the macrogrid, which uses electricity. It also mentions solar farms, which are there in Sacramento, California, which is a step towards reversing global warming. We discussed investigative journalism earlier. So, investigative journalism not only reports and suggests and points out the future, influences policy and influences public opinion, but it exposes corporate malfeasance too. Investigative journalists play a critical role in holding corporations accountable for their role in exacerbating climate change. Non-fiction books like Merchants of Doubt by Naomi Oreskes and Eric M. Conway, which we saw in an earlier lesson, expose how fossil fuel companies have funded disinformation campaigns to undermine climate science. These kind of reports, this investigative journalism, it shapes public perception. Non-fiction authors also shape public perception by challenging widely held beliefs and promoting new ways of thinking about climate change. An important book that could be considered crucial for this issue is The Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Kolbert. It redefines the public understanding of extinction as a contemporary human driven process rather than a distant historical event. Ethical considerations in writing about climate change. We also read about this book, Merchants of Doubt, where the ethical considerations were not considered by a group of scientists, and they misinformed the public about certain health and climate issues. So, ethical considerations are important uh, to inform the public correctly if one is to lighten the carbon footprint, if one is to uh, make a dent in the impact of climate change. So, accuracy and responsibility is important. Misrepresenting data or sensationalizing the impacts of climate change can undermine trust in the scientific community and weaken the credibility of the climate movement. So, ethical reporting and being ethical in one's considerations while investigating and while reporting, they are of extreme importance. Otherwise, the result is that scientists they'll lose the trust of the public, and the climate movement, which is with put together, which has come up with such difficulty and which has to cross so many barriers, that also gets weakened. Eventually, we all know that all this is in the interest of humanity. Writers must carefully balance the need to emphasize the urgency of the crisis with the responsibility to present the science accurately. The Uninhabitable Earth by David Wallace Wells, which vividly paints worst case scenarios, has been both praised for raising awareness and criticized for potentially exaggerating certain outcomes. So, out there are numerous books. In fact, now the number is growing from day to day as people in different walks of life, from different disciplines, they realize the urgency of the climate crisis. So there are some books that are very accurate, and they are giving the right picture to the readers. But even then, out there are some that are exaggerating, or some that they are not being ethical about their aims and their objectives. So there is always a conflict between the environmentalist and the capitalist. As I already mentioned, that Dipesh Chakravarti has mentioned capitalism as an important reason for climate change, and capitalism defines all achievements, all progress, all industry in human terms, whereas the non-human is equally responsible for everything that humans get, for all the comforts, for all the products. The non-human should also be involved. So it is not so, and it's capitalism that rules the roost, and that's why there are certain books and certain authors who tend to mislead the public. Another pitfall that is related to climate information, or let's say climate shock, is climate despair. Presenting the grim realities of global warming and ecological collapse without offering hope or solutions can lead to climate despair. So, we have time again discussed this, that this idea of doom, of the end of the world, all these ideas tend to create a very dark picture, and they might lead to climate despair. So the writers have to write in a responsible manner so that the readers and the public may not descend into despair, and they may feel so paralyzed that they may not be able to take action. Many contemporary authors, including Bill Gates and Christiana Figueres, in The Future We Choose, provide a balanced approach by discussing the potential for technological and policy solutions alongside the challenges. So there has to be a sense of balance maintained there's a moral and an ethical responsibility in for writers of non-fiction in climate change to maintain the fine balance because the threat is looming large. It should not be conveyed in a sense that one falls into such despair that one is not able to take action. So a fine line is there, and writers have to maintain that responsibly. Also, uh, non-climate, uh, also non-fiction related to climate change uh, may represent the affluent and the richer sections of society. So there should be an ethical representation of the vulnerable communities also. Climate change disproportionately affects marginalized and vulnerable communities, including indigenous populations, people of color, and low income communities. So one has to be ethical about that representation to think about the vulnerable uh, sections of society. They too should be represented, their suffering and their voices also should be represented, and it should not be only the voice of the affluent or the the who are prominent in society of those sections. Non-fiction writers must ethically represent these groups, ensuring that their voices are not exploited or marginalized in the narrative. Instead, writers should highlight the agency and leadership of these communities in addressing climate change, as seen in works like All We Can Save, a collection of essays by female climate leaders, many of whom come from marginalized backgrounds. So, this book of essay is important because it represents the voice of uh, female climate leaders who come from marginalized backgrounds. So, non-fiction related to climate change can represent uh, different, varying sections of society across the globe. As mentioned, people of color or women or people in the developing countries or indigenous tribes and groups. So climate change affects everyone, but the ones who are most vulnerable, they suffer the most because they don't have the ready finances to address their problems. Uh, Many times, people who are wealthy and affluent, they might be able to deal with water shortage or other issues, but those who are um, living below the poverty line or who are not affluent or who are from rural backgrounds or tribal areas, they may not be able to get all those benefits. So there has to be an ethical way of looking at things, and everybody should get a representation when uh, non-fiction and climate literature is written. Now, climate non-fiction climate literature can also consist of memoirs and personal accounts. So the first person narratives of climate experience tend to be very powerful, and they tend to tell you the real situation of the people who are affected. Personal accounts of living through climate change, such as memoirs by environmental activists, scientists, and those directly affected by climate disasters, help to contextualize the issue of everyday life. So, it is these narratives of climate experience that are very powerful, which are also a part of uh, non-fiction books on climate, and they can create awakening and around the globe, and they can prompt collective action. Dispatches from the New American Shore by Elizabeth Rush blend memoir and investigative reporting to document the author's experiences visiting communities. So, we can see that climate change is something that is disproportionate, and it hits everyone in a different way. So there are vast reaches of these continents, whether it's America or whether it's Asia or whether it's Africa, where people are affected in different ways. So books like this, they blend memoir and investigative reporting to document the author's experiences uh, visiting communities. Activist memoirs are also very important. Um, the people who decide to lead the climate change movements, the people who take action and work towards reducing the carbon footprint and the climate impact in various ways, their accounts of their memories are very important. Bill McKibben's memoir, Falter, has the human game begun to play itself out? This blends personal reflection with broader analysis of the environment and talks also about political challenges posed by climate change. Such works inspire readers by showcasing the resilience, persistence, and passion of those working for climate justice. So, it is something that may not be taught in schools, but it's something that life teaches them. They are people who feel the dejection of their community, they feel the suffering of their community because of extreme climate events. And that's why they take up activism and they take up leadership for a cause. And so their stories are stories of resilience, persistence, and passion. And they work for climate justice, and these stories need to be told. And these stories are able to inspire readers to take action. So they are memoirs of grief and loss also, and this is very common in today's day and age. After great climate calamities have taken place, we have been reading so much about the tsunami that came and how the survivors cope with things, or the survivors of the hurricanes that take place in America now and then, or survivors of earthquakes, or survivors of droughts in Africa. So the memoirs of grief and loss, they they focus on themes of grief, loss, and mourning for the planet. The End of Ice by Dar Jamil expresses a sense of sorrow for the environmental destruction already taking place, offering reflections on the emotional toll of witnessing ecosystems collapse. So it's like personal sorrow gets transformed into a larger sorrow in which one feels grief, a sense of loss for the loss of environment. And that leads to the creation of these works of non-fiction as well as works of climate fiction and climate poetry and climate drama. These memoirs often emphasize the importance of facing the emotional realities of climate change while also finding ways to cultivate hope and action. So, these memoirs are very useful. They show how one can cope with emotional realities, which are the outcome of climate change. We heard so many first person narratives about the forest fires that took place in Australia, and we heard about the remaining wildlife, and we heard about the baby koalas that had escaped from the jungles to save their lives, and how people picked them up and tried to give them a home, tried to sort of give them some kind of home and some kind of hope. So stories like this abound after climate crisis, for children, for animals, for so many people who lose their homes, so many people who lose their dear ones. And so these when books like The End of Ice talk about sorrow and grief of climate change. They also talk about facing the emotional realities of climate change and finding ways to cultivate hope and action. Raising public awareness. Non-fiction serves as a crucial tool for raising awareness about environmental issues, helping to educate the public on topics such as climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, and sustainability. Authors and activists use essays, articles, and books to translate complex scientific concepts into accessible language, making them relatable to the general public. Impactful narratives. So, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring 1962 was important as an impactful narrative which sort of changed so many mindsets. It set the climate movement rolling. So, her detailed investigation into the dangers of pesticides not only informed the public but also sparked a national conversation about environmental responsibility. So, even though the pharmaceutical companies tried to ban the book for several years, uh, the book came out into the open. Her ideas and her work in the Silent Spring could not remain concealed and suppressed. It was picked up and it sort of spanned a new movement of climate change or climate awareness. The book's compelling narrative style, backed by meticulous research, enabled readers to grasp the dire consequences of pesticide used on wildlife and human health, ultimately leading to significant policy changes, including the eventual establishment of US Environmental Protection Agency EPA and a ban on DDT. So books like this, non-fiction books like this, create public awareness and lead to a change in public policy. So, for example, when we are told about the insecticides and the pesticides that we use at home to kill mosquitoes and to kill cockroaches, we are told that they are banned in countries like USA and Canada. So that means there has been active legislation and there has been a very strong public opinion which has led to this legislation that these chemicals will not be used, these pesticides will not be used. So in India, it is a quite a sad fact that we still use those things that are banned elsewhere. So and it's like we don't seem to have any other option to save ourselves from the pests and the mosquitoes. But it's not so. There are books that tell you about how to use safer means of keeping yourself of keeping away mosquitoes, pests, and flies. So there are many herbs and there are many natural ways which are pest repellent and which do not harm the environment. So this kind of uh, understanding has now penetrated the Western world, and that's why many of the pesticides that we use are banned in America, in Europe, and in Canada. Media coverage. Investigative journalism has been instrumental in bringing environmental issues to light. Reporters uncover and report on environmental injustices, corporate negligence, and government inaction. The Flint water crisis exposes systemic failures and it mobilized public pressure for change. So, as I was saying, that there are certain things that are banned in the Western world. It is because of this investigative journalism, it's because of media coverage, it's because of everything that is carried in these non fiction books on climate change. And people become aware. People become aware of the, the meat they eat, the chicken they eat, the fish they eat. So in today's day and age, we hear about free range chicken, so which is or free range milk or free range eggs, all food that is not processed and that is not based on chemicals to feed the livestock. Rather, it is created naturally. All the chickens and the cows, they are allowed to have freedom, and they live in the natural world. So that's why that awareness of free range is there. But in the developing countries, that awareness is coming very slowly. In fact, one does not know when one goes looking for organic, whether it is really organic here or not. So the Flint water crisis showed how public pressure could influence legislation. These climate non-fiction books, they provide scientific evidence. So scientific non-fiction plays a critical role in shaping environmental policies by offering robust evidence-based analysis of ecological issues. So there's a book by Mark Meslin, a very short introduction to climate change, and it simplifies science so that uh, a layperson can also understand the basics of climate change, the future, the causes, uh, the science behind it. So this is one of the important books which offers robust evidence-based analysis of ecological issues. Scientific reports and research publications inform policymakers about the latest findings, helping them understand the complexities of environmental problems and the efficacy of potential solutions. So, in India, where we rely so much on natural herbs in our kitchen and natural spices, one should not be short of material that will help us to live sustainably. We should not be short of ideas to eat sustainably. But problems in India are very complex, even though there are scientific reports and research publications that are meant to influence uh, public opinion and government policies, but it takes time to reach, because I suppose one of the reasons is that all the things that are banned by in the foreign countries, in the Western countries, lead to losses. So it is again a part of capitalism that those things are dumped on the developing countries. So at least the investment may come. So the money and the capital may come from uh, producing, from manufacturing those chemicals. So there are many complex environmental problems and many complex issues and causes, but it's this non-fiction that gives information and helps us to make healthy and sustainable choices. The book, The Future of Life by Edward O. Wilson, it is a very important book uh, on science, on climate, on the universe, and it is a book that has been much quoted by uh, Dipesh Chakravarti and other important writers. The book gives a long list of endangered species. It equates the preservation of biodiversity with the preservation of human life. So, whatever extinction is there in biodiversity will have negative repercussions on the human life. So, he equates the preservation of biodiversity with the preservation of human life. It's like their loss is our loss, and we are all part of the same world. It's like we are living in a house where the walls separating separate parts of the beings, whether human or non-human, the walls are very thin. If calamity strikes the house, why should it spare us and not them? It there's a problem which will strike everyone together. So we are all part of it, as if living in on the earth under a common structure, a common network, and one corner, if it suffers problems, that is bound to affect everybody else in that house. So everybody will feel the tremors of that. So he talks about biodiversity and how not to take it lightly, He gives a very long list about the extinct birds and animal species. It focuses on the extinction of species but also offers hope in a climate change world. So it talks about the extinction of many species but also offers hope in a climate change world. He also looks at the ethical perceptions on climate change. So this is a book on on biodiversity, on climate change, on hope, and the ethics also. Intergovernmental reports are an important part of climate nonfiction. Reports produced by organizations such as the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change (IPCC) provide comprehensive assessments of climate science, impacts, and mitigation strategies. These reports synthesize extensive research and offer a clear recommendation for governments worldwide. So, IPCC is greatly respected. Its reports are very detailed and they are worked at and developed by scientists around the world. And the assessments are very important because based on the reports of IPCC, the international summits can make plans for uh, policy related to climate change. The IPCC findings have been instrumental in shaping international climate agreements such as the Paris Agreement by providing a scientific basis for discussions on emissions reduction targets. So we have the target that carbon content should be less than 2 degrees centigrade. So all this comes from the findings and the research done by the IPCC. So this is a very important organization, and when one talks of climate change, one also talks about the IPCC and its assessments. If we read the book by Mark Meslin, we come across important assessments about the future climate made by IPCC. Public health and environment. The link between environmental factors and public health is another area where non-fiction literature has influenced policy. So there is a link between environmental factors and public health, and this is where non-fiction literature has influenced policy. And studies documenting the health impacts of air and water pollution, climate change, and habitat destruction inform regulatory measures. For example, research showing the detrimental effects of air quality on respiratory health has led to stricter air pollution standards and regulations aimed at improving public health outcomes. So, we already know that such reports and such work done influenced how we tried to tackle COVID. So, numerous reports and writings influence the procedures and the outcomes of government legislation during the COVID this thing infestation. Influencing policy advocacy. Non-fiction writing often serves as a foundation for policy advocacy, providing the necessary data and narratives to support environmental movements. Policy briefs, advocacy reports, and position papers written by non-profit organizations, think tanks, and scholars influence legislators and public opinion. So, this kind of influence on policy advocacy, this can be done by NGOs also, who have been mentioned in these non-fiction writings, and where there is enough data about climate change narratives and climate suffering, which is behind environmental movements, and this influences the legislators and public officials. Position papers and advocacy reports. organizations such as the World Wildlife Fund and Greenpeace produce non-fiction reports that outline the urgency of environmental issues and propose specific policy recommendations. So we can see that climate change is not limited to just weather, it also means various issues related to water, food, animals, biodiversity, etc. So organizations like the World Wildlife Fund and Greenpeace, they also provide non-fiction reports that outline the urgency of environmental issues, and they propose and suggest specific policy recommendations. For instance, the WWF's Living Planet report provides data on biodiversity and ecosystem health, illustrating the need for urgent conservation measures. Such reports not only inform policymakers but also engage the public and mobilize support for environmental narratives. So all this work, it has a legislative impact as an outcome. Authors and activists often engage directly with lawmakers to shape environmental legislation. Books and articles that present compelling arguments for specific policies, such as renewable energy incentives or carbon pricing, contribute to informed debates within legislative bodies. The advocacy efforts surrounding the Green New Deal in the US illustrate how non-fiction literature and activist writings can influence broader political discourse and drive political agendas. And all this also creates a collective movement. It fosters community engagement. Non-fiction plays a vital role in fostering community engagement and activism around environmental issues. By sharing personal stories, local histories, and case studies, non-fiction writers empower communities to take action and advocate for their environmental rights. Environmental memoirs and personal narratives. Books such as Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, which has been greatly praised by Llewellyn Vaughan Lee in the interview that we read. Such books highlight the deep connection between people and the land, blending indigenous wisdom with personal narrative. So, this indigenous wisdom that comes through non-fiction writing in books like this, Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, it is about indigenous wisdom, and there is a lot that can be learned from it. Such works inspire readers to recognize their role in environmental stewardship and advocate for sustainable practices. Kimmerer's narrative emphasizes the importance of traditional ecological knowledge. It emphasizes traditional ecological knowledge and its relevance in contemporary conservation efforts. So, Kimmerer writes about indigenous wisdom and the connection of indigenous people with their land, and such books they provide wisdom and ideas that could help tackle climate change. In a country like India, regions are very important. There are various regions in every state. Some are backward, some are tribal regions, there are linguistic divisions, and there are cultural divisions. Different localities are there. So, local case studies also figure importantly in climate non-fiction. Non-fiction that focuses on local environmental issues can galvanize community action. For example, writings that document local population crisis, land degradation, or habitat destruction can mobilize residents to advocate for change. By illuminating the impacts of environmental degradation on specific communities in specific areas, nonfiction helps build grassroots movements and empowers individuals to demand accountability from corporations and governments. So, we have areas in South India which have received uh, too much rain and there is flooding, so they have different issues, or there are places in remote in Kashmir which have their own climate issues. So then there are areas in Uttarakhand, there are pilgrimage sites where there has been flooding and there have been landslides. So issues related to certain areas, certain places representing specific communities, um, and that in non-fiction it creates grassroots movements and helps change public policy, helps influencing the government and corporations to take action. So, as we can see that climate change is something that can be represented through numerous studies, numerous forms of writing. So, it can be creative writing or it can be non-fiction writing. As we have seen in all the books that we considered so far, there was a great variety. There were books that told us about the science behind climate impacts and climate change. There were books that talked about what makes up the greenhouse gases and how they impact the universe. There were books about resolutions. There are books that talked about individual issues related to climate impacts. For example, the idea of plastic dumping in oceans and how it affects the ocean, and it also affects human life. So then there are books that may address uh, local regions, the regions of fishermen, or where there are farming communities in somewhere in Kashmir, or there might be places where spices are grown in the south, and what threatens the those areas or plantations where those specific spices are grown. Or it may be about pest infestations in certain parts of the country. And throughout, there are people who are not only climate activists, but there are books that also talk about how there are people out there who are trying to save, almost extinct species of plants. For example, varieties of rice, varieties of vegetables, and there are such organizations, for example, in Madhya Pradesh, where they work at preserving and trying to bring and nurture the old varieties of vegetables which are not seen in the market these days. So, when we talk about those old varieties of rice or wheat or vegetables, then it is these writings that tell us about them, because the market forces, the international market forces, they only focus on selling cash crops. For example, the focus is on bananas or the focus on basmati rice. But the truth is that such reports and such non-fiction books tell us about numerous other varieties of bananas than the one that is sold in the international market, and numerous varieties of rice, and of cereals, of millets that are out there. And the farmers, if they continue to grow things that have naturally been grown, trying to preserve the original old crop in their fields. It becomes a benefit to the environment and also a benefit to them and a benefit to humanity. So such reports are also there, brought through non-fiction, climate literature, and there have been numerous books about these. There are numerous books about extinct species of animals and birds too. There's one book that we talked about, uh, the climate change resolutions, which reads like a coffee table book. So there's no dearth of material on climate non-fiction, but one has to be very careful in what to choose to read, because all of it may not focus on the truth. Many of the books might just raise an alarm and nothing else, and make people fall into climate despair. So one has to be very careful about dealing with what one is reading and to select the right kind of literature. India is a very rich country, so there are various foods and vegetables that have been traditionally grown in local areas and which are gradually being eliminated by the international market, and so they should get a chance to be preserved, to be grown, and to be placed in the market, because those crops which benefited our ancestors also had powers in them to reduce the climate impact. Some of the steps that have been suggested to reduce the carbon footprint are that one should eat local food. So these varieties of foods uh, which are available locally are not only healthy, not only economically good for our farmers, but they are also uh, good for the environment, because when we talk about ecosystems, there is an interconnection. When foreign crops are introduced and old traditional crops are removed, that is once again disturbing the environment. So the kind of balance, the kind of pattern of their growing according to seasons, the change, everything was related to how it controlled the pest uh, and the growth. So this modernization and commercialism, this industrialization of our basic foods, processing of our basic food has created a great problem and has broken this chain that kept us healthy and that kept our environment healthy.